The fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast harsh shadows across Dr. Elena Marchetti's face as she stared down at the man lying on the gurney before her. His hand was mangled, crushed in what the paramedics had described as a construction accident, and he was screaming for someone, anyone, to save what was left of his fingers. She recognized him instantly, even through the sweat and pain etched across his features. Marcus Holloway, the same man who had stood in her sister's kitchen 3 years ago, pointing his finger at her with cruel precision, telling her she was too damaged, too broken, too unlovable to ever find happiness again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now that same finger hung by a thread of torn flesh and shattered bone, and he was begging her to fix it. The irony wasn't lost on her. She pulled on her surgical gloves with practiced calm, her wedding ring catching the light beneath the latex. The ring that proved everything Marcus had said was a lie. The ring that represented a love so deep, so transformative, that it had healed wounds she didn't even know she carried. Elena looked down at Marcus's terrified eyes, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. She could see the recognition dawning in his face, the memory of his own words coming back to haunt him. She could walk away. She could let another surgeon take this case. But that wasn't who she was. That wasn't who love had taught her to become. Elena Marchetti had always believed that some wounds never truly heal, they just learn to hide better. 3 years ago, she would have agreed with anyone who said she was unmarriageable, too complicated, too scarred by life to ever be someone's first choice. But that was before she understood the difference between being broken and being human, before she learned that the right person doesn't fix you, they love you while you fix yourself. The morning everything changed began like any other Tuesday in her residency. Elena was pulling a double shift at Metropolitan General, her 3rd consecutive day without proper sleep, surviving on cafeteria coffee and the stubborn determination that had carried her through medical school. She was in her final year of surgical residency, specializing in reconstructive hand surgery, a field that required both technical precision and an almost artistic understanding of how to rebuild what had been destroyed. Her phone buzzed as she finished suturing a patient who had put his fist through a window during a domestic dispute. The text was from her sister Sarah, and it made her stomach clench with familiar dread. "Family dinner Sunday. Marcus will be there. Please come. We miss you." Elena stared at the message, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest. Marcus Holloway had been her sister's boyfriend for 2 years, and in that time, he had made his opinion of Elena abundantly clear. She was the damaged sister, the one who threw herself into work to avoid dealing with her emotions, the one who would end up alone because she was too afraid to let anyone close enough to matter. The last time she had seen Marcus, at Sarah's birthday party 6 months earlier, he had cornered her in the kitchen while everyone else was outside enjoying the barbecue. His words had been delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who believed he was stating obvious facts. "You know Sarah worries about you," he had said, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "She thinks you're going to end up one of those bitter career women who dies alone with her cats." I told her not to worry, that some people are just meant to be alone. "It's not personal, Elena. You're just too intense. Too focused on other people's problems instead of your own. No man wants to come home to that every night." Elena had left the party early that night, driving home in silence while his words echoed in her mind. The worst part wasn't that he had said them, but that some small, wounded part of her had wondered if he might be right. She had been single for 3 years, had turned down more dates than she accepted, had prioritized her career over relationships with a single-minded determination that sometimes frightened even her. Maybe she was too much, too demanding, too used to being alone to ever learn how to be part of something bigger. But Tuesday mornings in the emergency room had a way of putting things in perspective. As she finished with the domestic violence case, Elena reminded herself that she had chosen this life, this work, because it mattered. She had chosen to rebuild what others had broken, to give people back the use of their hands, their ability to touch, to create, to hold the people they loved. If that made her unmarriageable in Marcus's eyes, then perhaps his opinion said more about him than it did about her. The trauma alert came through just as she was heading to the break room for what she hoped would be 5 minutes of peace. "Multi-vehicle accident, incoming. ETA, 3 minutes." We've got a cardiac case and a hand trauma that's going to need surgical intervention. Elena sighed, pulled her hair back into a fresh ponytail, and headed for the trauma bay. This was the part of the job that never got easier. The way human bodies could be transformed from whole to broken in the space of a heartbeat, the way life could change direction without warning or preparation. She was checking the surgical instruments when Dr. James Chen walked into the trauma bay, and Elena felt something shift in the air around her. She had seen him before, of course. Metropolitan General wasn't that large, and Dr. Chen was the kind of surgeon other surgeons talked about in reverent whispers. He was a cardiac surgeon, young for his level of expertise, with a reputation for taking cases other doctors wouldn't touch, and somehow finding ways to save what everyone else thought was beyond saving. But she had never worked directly with him, had never been close enough to notice the way he moved through the hospital with quiet confidence, never close enough to see the kindness in his eyes when he looked at patients, never close enough to realize that he had been watching her too. "Dr. Marchetti," he said, his voice warm despite the clinical setting. "I heard you were handling the hand trauma. The cardiac case is stable for now, but if you need any assistance with your patient, I'm here." There was something in the way he said it that made Elena look up from her instrument tray, something that suggested he wasn't just making polite conversation. She had worked with dozens of doctors over the years, and most of them treated residents like convenient extensions of their own hands, useful but ultimately disposable. Dr. Chen was looking at her like she was a colleague, like her opinion mattered. The ambulance arrived with sirens blaring, and Elena pushed all other thoughts aside as the paramedics wheeled in their patient. The man was conscious but in shock, his left hand crushed in what appeared to be a hydraulic press accident. She could see immediately that this was going to be a complex reconstruction, the kind of surgery that would take hours and require every skill she had developed over the past 4 years of training. "What do we have?" Dr. Chen asked, moving to the opposite side of the gurney as Elena began her assessment. "Male, approximately 35, crush injury to the left hand with multiple fractures and severe soft tissue damage," Elena replied, her hands gentle but thorough as she examined the extent of the trauma. "We're looking at possible amputation of the index and middle fingers, but I think we can save them if we move quickly." She was so focused on the medical assessment that it took her several minutes to really look at the patient's face. When she did, her hands stilled for just a moment before her professional training kicked back in. Marcus Holloway stared up at her through eyes clouded with pain and shock, his face pale with blood loss and terror. For just an instant, she saw recognition flicker across his features, followed quickly by something that might have been embarrassment or fear. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the trauma bay. "Please don't let me lose my hand. I'm a contractor. I need my hands to work. Please." Elena met his eyes steadily, her voice calm and professional. "We're going to take very good care of you, Mr. Holloway. You're in the right place." She turned to Dr. Chen, who had been watching the interaction with quiet attention. "This is going to be a long surgery. The damage is extensive, but I believe we can achieve a good functional outcome if we work together." Dr. Chen nodded, already reaching for his surgical gloves. "Then let's get started. What do you need from me?" As they prepared Marcus for surgery, Elena found herself thinking about the strange ways life circles back on itself. How the universe sometimes arranges things so that we end up exactly where we need to be, doing exactly what we were meant to do. 3 hours later, when they finally stepped out of the operating room, Marcus's hand was rebuilt, scarred but functional, saved by the woman he had once dismissed as too broken to love, and the man who would soon prove him spectacularly wrong. The weeks following Marcus's surgery passed in a blur of follow-up appointments and carefully managed encounters. Elena found herself dreading each visit, not because of the medical complexity of his case, but because of the way he looked at her now. Gone was the casual dismissiveness she had grown accustomed to over the years. Instead, there was something desperate in his eyes, a gratitude that felt uncomfortably heavy and somehow possessive. Dr. James Chen, however, had become a constant presence in her life in ways that surprised her. What had started as professional collaboration had evolved into something deeper, though Elena was almost afraid to name it. He had a way of appearing in the hospital cafeteria just as she was grabbing a quick lunch, of finding her in the break room during those rare, quiet moments between surgeries. Their conversations flowed easily, from medical cases to books to the small observations about life that people share when they're beginning to trust each other. "You did beautiful work on Holloway's hand," James said one evening as they walked through the hospital parking garage together. It had become an unspoken routine, this walk to their cars, a way of extending their time together without the clinical backdrop of the hospital. "I've seen a lot of reconstructive surgeries, but the precision of your microsurgery on those tendons was remarkable." Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, but there was something else there too, a nagging discomfort she couldn't quite identify. "He's responding well to physical therapy. Should have full function restored within 6 months." She paused beside her car, keys in hand, not quite ready for the conversation to end. "James, can I ask you something?" He turned to face her fully, his expression open and attentive in a way that still caught her off guard. Most of the doctors she knew were always partially distracted, their minds racing ahead to the next case, the next problem to solve. James had this rare ability to be completely present in a moment. "Anything," he said simply. "That night in surgery, you never asked why I knew the patient's name before looking at his chart." Most doctors would have been curious about that kind of familiarity with a trauma case. Elena studied his face, looking for signs of the judgment she had learned to expect from others. James was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I figured if it was relevant to his medical care, you would have mentioned it. If it was personal, then it was your business to share or not share." He smiled then, a zoe expression that transformed his entire face from serious to almost boyish. "Besides, I was too busy being impressed by your surgical skills to think about much else." That night, Elena lay awake thinking about the difference between being known and being understood. Marcus had known her for years, had observed her through the lens of family gatherings and holiday dinners, and had somehow concluded that she was fundamentally flawed, too damaged for love. James had known her for weeks, had seen her in the most stressful professional situations imaginable, and somehow saw strength where Marcus had seen weakness, dedication where Marcus had seen obsession. The phone call came on a Thursday evening while Elena was reviewing surgical notes in her apartment. Sarah's voice was strained, unusually formal. "Elena, we need to talk. Can you come over tomorrow night? Marcus wants to speak with you." Elena felt her stomach drop. She had been successfully avoiding family gatherings since Marcus's surgery, claiming busy hospital schedules and overwhelming caseloads. The truth was simpler and more complicated. She wasn't ready to navigate the strange new dynamic between them, wasn't prepared for whatever gratitude or guilt Marcus might want to express. "What does he want to talk about?" Elena asked, though part of her already knew. "He's been different since the accident," Sarah said carefully. "More thoughtful, I guess. He keeps talking about second chances, about how the surgery made him realize things about himself he didn't like. He specifically asked me to invite you to dinner. He said he has something important to say." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of family obligations settle on her shoulders. "Sarah, I don't think that's a good idea. Our relationship has always been complicated, and I don't want to make things awkward for you. Please, Elena." He's really trying to change. The accident scared him, made him think about what kind of person he wants to be. And, honestly, I think you both need this conversation. The next evening, Elena found herself standing on her sister's front porch, her palms slightly damp, despite the cool October air. She had changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on a simple navy dress that felt professional enough to maintain some distance, but casual enough not to seem like she was trying too hard. As she raised her hand to knock, she thought about James, about the text he had sent earlier wishing her luck with whatever family situation was requiring her attention. He didn't push for details, didn't demand explanations, just offered support in the quiet, steady way that was becoming characteristic of everything he did. Marcus answered the door, his left hand still wrapped in a light bandage but moving with increasing flexibility. The sight of her handiwork healing properly gave Elena a moment of professional satisfaction, even as personal anxiety churned in her stomach. "Elena," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Thank you for coming. I know this is probably the last place you want to be." Sarah appeared behind him, her smile bright but nervous. Come in. Dinner's almost ready. Marcus has been cooking all afternoon." She shot her boyfriend a look that Elena couldn't quite interpret, something between encouragement and warning. The dining room was set more formally than Elena remembered from previous family gatherings. Candles flickered on the table, casting warm light across Marcus's face as he served what appeared to be an elaborate attempt at Elena's favorite meal from their childhood. She recognized her mother's recipe for braised chicken with herbs, the dish Sarah used to make when Elena was studying for medical school exams and too stressed to remember to eat. "I called Mom for the recipe," Marcus said, noticing her recognition. "Sarah told me it was something special for you." Elena took a careful bite, tasting not just the familiar flavors but also the obvious effort Marcus had put into recreating something meaningful to her. It was good. Surprisingly good, though not quite the same as their mother's version. The gesture itself was more important than the execution, and Elena found herself momentarily disarmed by the thoughtfulness behind it. "Marcus, this is really lovely," she said, and meant it. "You didn't have to go to so much trouble." "Yes, I did," he replied, setting down his fork and looking directly at her. "Elena, I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you several apologies, but I'm hoping we can start with the most important one." Sarah had grown very still, her attention focused on her plate as if she could make herself invisible through careful attention to her food. Elena realized this conversation had been planned, rehearsed, and that Sarah had probably heard some version of it already. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You saved my hand," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "But more than that, you saved my career, my ability to provide for myself, my future. You did that after I spent years treating you like you were somehow less than, like your choices made you worth less as a person." He paused, running his good hand through his hair in a gesture Elena recognized as nervous energy. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about a lot of things." Elena felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, though she wasn't sure if it was relief or something more complex. "Marcus, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "I need to say this, and you need to hear it. When I was lying on that gurney, when I thought I might lose my hand, the only thing I could think about was all the things I wouldn't be able to do anymore. All the ways my life would change. And then you walked into that room, and I remembered every cruel thing I had ever said to you about being alone, about being too focused on your work, about being unmarriageable." His voice cracked slightly. "And you saved me anyway. You spent hours rebuilding what I had destroyed, giving me back my future, and you did it with more grace and professionalism than I had any right to expect." Elena looked across the table at this man who had been a source of tension and hurt for so long, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. She could see the genuine remorse in his eyes, the weight of recognition that his words had carried more power than he had realized. But she could also see something else, something that made her slightly uncomfortable in its intensity. "I'm glad the surgery was successful," Elena said carefully. "That's what any doctor would have done in that situation." "No," Marcus said firmly. "Any doctor would have done the surgery. You did something more than that. You treated me with kindness I didn't deserve. You gave me compassion I had never shown you." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright with an emotion Elena couldn't quite name. "I've been thinking a lot about second chances, about the kind of person I want to be going forward. And I've been thinking about you." Elena felt a chill run down her spine, a warning that this conversation was about to veer into territory she wasn't prepared to navigate. "Marcus, I know I have no right to ask this," he continued, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them out before his courage failed. "But I was hoping you might give me a chance to show you who I really am. Who I can be when I'm not hiding behind fear and jealousy and insecurity." He glanced at Sarah, who was staring at her plate with intense concentration. "I've been talking to Sarah about this, and she thinks maybe there's a way for us to start over. All of us." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, the distant sound of traffic outside, the rapid beating of her own heart. She looked at Sarah, who finally raised her eyes to meet hers, and Elena saw something there that made her stomach clench with understanding. "Sarah," Elena said slowly, "what exactly has Marcus been talking to you about?" Her sister's face flushed pink, and she fidgeted with her napkin before answering. "He thinks maybe he made a mistake," she said quietly. "Maybe he judged you too quickly, before he really knew who you were. And maybe, if you were willing, the three of us could figure out a way to be a real family." Elena felt the room tilt slightly, the implications of what she was hearing settling over her like a cold fog. "Sarah, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Marcus reached across the table, his injured hand moving carefully toward hers. "I'm saying that I was wrong about you being unmarriageable. I'm saying that maybe the reason I was so critical of you was because I was afraid of how I really felt. I'm saying that maybe there's something here worth exploring, if you're open to it." Elena pulled her hand back instinctively, her mind racing. She thought of James, of the quiet certainty she felt when she was with him, of the way he saw her not as someone to be fixed or changed, but as someone already whole and worthy of love. She thought of the text message on her phone, the simple "good luck tonight," that had meant more to her than all of Marcus's elaborate apologies and carefully prepared meals. "I need to go," Elena said, standing so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this. I can't be part of whatever this is." "Elena, please," Sarah said, rising as well. "Just think about it. Marcus has changed. He's really trying to be better." Elena looked at her sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Sarah, who had always been the easier daughter, the one who chose conventional paths in traditional relationships. Sarah, who had spent her whole life trying to smooth over conflicts and make everyone happy, even when happiness required someone else to diminish themselves. "Sarah, do you hear what you're asking me?" Elena's voice was steady, but there was steel beneath the calm. "You're asking me to consider a relationship with a man who spent years telling me I was unlovable, who made me question my own worth, who treated me like a consolation prize he might be willing to accept now that he's realized I have value." She shook her head, feeling clarity cut through the confusion like a surgical blade. "And you're asking me to do this while he's still in a relationship with you? Do you understand how deeply wrong that is?" Marcus stood as well, his expression shifting from hopeful to defensive. "I thought you would understand about second chances. I thought someone who spends her life fixing what's broken would appreciate the chance to fix something between us." Elena felt something cold and final settle in her chest. "Marcus, I don't fix broken people. I fix broken bones and damaged tissue. And this isn't broken. It's manipulative." She turned toward the door, then paused. "The surgery I performed saved your hand, but it doesn't make you a different person. And it certainly doesn't make me available for whatever fantasy you've constructed about redemption and second chances." As she reached for her coat, her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Hope dinner is going well. If you need an escape route, I'm at the hospital and could use help with a consult." The timing was so perfect it made her smile despite everything else. Elena looked back at Marcus and Sarah one more time, seeing them both clearly now. "I hope you both find what you're looking for," she said quietly. "But you won't find it with me." She walked out into the cool night air, pulling out her phone to text James back. "Dinner ended early. Would love to help with that consult if the offer still stands." His response came immediately. "Always. I'll be in the cardiac wing." "And Elena? Whatever happened tonight, I'm glad you're coming here instead of wherever else you could go." As Elena drove through the city toward the hospital, toward James, toward the life she was building for herself, she realized that Marcus had been right about one thing. She did believe in second chances. She believed in them for people who earned them, who did the work to change, who understood the difference between making amends and making demands. But mostly she believed in first chances, real chances, with people who saw her worth from the beginning and never asked her to prove it. Elena found James exactly where he said he would be, bent over a patient chart in the cardiac wing, his dark hair slightly disheveled from what had obviously been a long day. The sight of him there, solid and focused and exactly who he had always been, made something inside her chest settle back into place. He looked up as she approached, and his expression shifted immediately from professional concentration to genuine concern. "That bad?" he asked, taking in her slightly wind-blown appearance and the tension she knew must be visible in her shoulders. "Worse than I expected," Elena admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he handed her from the small pot he kept in his office, but also clarifying in ways I didn't anticipate. James waited, patient as always, letting her find her words without pressure or expectation. It was one of the things she had come to treasure about him, this ability to create space for whatever she needed to say without filling the silence with assumptions or advice. "My sister's boyfriend wants to date me," Elena said finally, the words sounding even more absurd spoken aloud than they had in her head. "While still dating my sister. Apparently, saving his hand from amputation has convinced him that he misjudged my marriageability." James was quiet for a long moment, processing not just her words but the layers of hurt and manipulation they represented. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "That's quite a revelation to spring on someone over dinner." "The worst part is that Sarah seemed to think it was a reasonable request," Elena continued, sinking into the chair across from his desk. "Like I should be flattered that he's reconsidered his assessment of my worth as a human being." "And what did you tell them?" Elena met his eyes, seeing something there that made her pulse quicken slightly. "I told them that I wasn't interested in being anyone's second choice or charity case. And then I left." James leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good for you." The weeks that followed passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. Elena threw herself into her work with renewed focus, taking on complex cases that other residents avoided, staying late to perfect surgical techniques that were already beyond what was expected of someone at her level. James was a constant presence, not hovering or checking up on her, but simply there when she needed a colleague to consult with, a friend to grab coffee with, or someone who understood the particular exhaustion that came from spending your days rebuilding what others had broken. Their relationship shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly, from professional collaboration to something deeper. They began meeting for lunch outside the hospital, walking through the small park across the street, where they could talk without the constant interruption of pages and emergency calls. James told her about his childhood in San Francisco, about parents who had emigrated from Taiwan with medical degrees that weren't recognized in the United States, about watching them rebuild their careers from nothing, and learning that resilience was a choice you made every day. Elena found herself sharing stories she had never told anyone, about the loneliness of growing up as the difficult daughter, the one who asked too many questions and wanted too much from life, about choosing medicine not just as a career but as a way of proving that her intensity had value, that her refusal to accept things as they were could actually make the world better. "You know what I love about reconstructive surgery?" James asked one afternoon as they sat by the fountain in the park center. "It's honest. You can't fake your way through rebuilding someone's hand. Either you have the skill and patience to do it right, or you don't. Either you succeed in giving them back their function, or you fail. There's no gray area." Elena nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. It's the opposite of most human relationships, isn't it? All the ways people pretend to be something they're not. All the expectations and disappointments and miscommunications. "Most relationships," James said quietly. "Not all of them." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and understanding, and Elena felt something shift inside her chest. A recognition that this was what she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but this quiet certainty that she was known and valued exactly as she was. The disruption came, as disruptions often do, without warning or preparation. Elena was reviewing surgical notes in the hospital library when her phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and Elena hesitated before answering, unsure she was ready for whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Elena, you need to know something." Sarah's voice was strained, urgent in a way that immediately put Elena on alert. "Marcus has been calling you. He's been trying to reach you for days." "I've been ignoring his calls," Elena said calmly. "I thought I made it clear that I wasn't interested in continuing that conversation." "It's not about that," Sarah said quickly. "It's about his hand. Something's wrong with the surgery site, and he's convinced himself that you did something to sabotage the reconstruction." Elena felt ice water flow through her veins. "What exactly is he claiming?" "He's saying the healing isn't progressing the way it should, that there's something deliberate about the way the tendons are responding to physical therapy." He's talking about getting a second opinion, maybe even filing a complaint with the medical board. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet. She had seen this before, patients who became convinced that complications were somehow intentional, who turned gratitude into suspicion when healing didn't progress exactly as they had imagined it would. Sarah, surgical complications happen. The human body doesn't always heal according to textbook timelines, especially with crush injuries as severe as Marcus's. His expectations may be unrealistic. I know that, Sarah said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. But Elena, he's not thinking clearly about this. He's been obsessing over it since that dinner, since you rejected his proposal. I think he's looking for a way to hurt you back. That evening, Elena sat in James's office, spreading Marcus's medical records across his desk. She had pulled the complete file, every x-ray, every surgical note, every follow-up appointment. James reviewed them methodically, his expression growing more serious with each page. Your surgical technique was flawless, he said finally. The reconstruction was textbook perfect, actually better than textbook. These complications he's experiencing are well within normal parameters for this type of injury. But they could be interpreted as problematic by someone looking for problems, Elena said, voicing the fear she had been carrying for days. By someone who doesn't understand microsurgery, yes, James agreed. But any qualified orthopedic surgeon would recognize this as standard postoperative progression. Elena stared at the x-rays showing Marcus's healing bones, at the surgical notes documenting her careful reconstruction of damaged tendons and ligaments. She had spent hours saving his hand, had given him back his career and his future, and now he was using that gift as a weapon against her. He's going to file a complaint, she said quietly, and even if it gets dismissed, it will be part of my record. Future employers will see it, question my surgical competence. James was quiet for a long moment, studying not the medical records but Elena's face. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Elena, I want you to listen to me carefully. I've worked with dozens of residents over the years, and I've seen thousands of surgical reconstructions. What you did for Marcus Holloway was exceptional work, under extremely difficult circumstances. Any surgeon would be proud to have their name on that case. But if he files a complaint, then we fight it, James said simply. With evidence, with expert testimony, with the complete medical record that shows exactly how skilled and careful you were. He reached across the desk, covering her hand with his. And you won't fight it alone. The medical board hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in December, in a sterile conference room that reminded Elena uncomfortably of the emergency room where this had all begun. Marcus sat across from her, his left hand prominently displayed on the table, the scars from her surgery visible but the function clearly intact. His lawyer was a sharp-dressed woman who spoke in precise legal language about standards of care and patient expectations. Elena had spent weeks preparing, reviewing not just Marcus's case but every similar reconstruction she had performed during her residency. James had helped her compile expert opinions from 3 different orthopedic surgeons, all confirming that her technique had been not just adequate, but exemplary. But as Marcus's lawyer outlined his complaints, Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. The accusations were carefully crafted, technically sophisticated in ways that suggested significant research. Claims about deliberately compromised tendon repair, intentionally incomplete bone setting, surgical choices made more for the convenience of the surgeon than the benefit of the patient. Dr. Marchetti, the board chair said, turning his attention to Elena, how do you respond to these allegations? Elena stood, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest. She had faced this moment in her mind dozens of times over the past weeks, had prepared statements and explanations and defenses, but now, looking across the table at Marcus, at the man whose hand she had saved and who was now trying to destroy her career, she felt something different than fear or anger. She felt clarity. I stand behind every decision I made in Mr. Holloway's operating room, she said, her voice calm and professional. I followed standard protocols for crush injury reconstruction, and I achieved the best possible outcome given the severity of his trauma. She paused, meeting Marcus's eyes directly. Mr. Holloway has full function in his injured hand. He has returned to work as a contractor. He has regained everything the accident took from him, and he gained it because of surgical intervention that was both skillful and successful. The board chair nodded, making notes. And how do you explain the complications Mr. Holloway has experienced? They are well within normal parameters for this type of injury, Elena replied. Hand reconstruction is a complex process that requires months of healing and physical therapy. Mr. Holloway's progress has been excellent by any medical standard. Marcus's lawyer leaned forward. Dr. Marchetti, isn't it true that you had a personal relationship with Mr. Holloway prior to his surgery? And isn't it possible that this relationship influenced your surgical decisions? Elena felt the room grow very quiet, felt the weight of several pairs of eyes focusing on her with new intensity. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment when her professional competence would be questioned not on its own merits, but through the lens of personal drama she had never wanted or invited. I knew Mr. Holloway through my sister, Elena said carefully. That relationship did not influence my surgical decisions in any way. I performed the same surgery I would have performed for any patient with similar injuries. But you did know him personally, the lawyer pressed. You had history with him. Elena looked around the room, at the board members watching her with neutral expressions, at Marcus sitting with his perfectly functional hand folded on the table, at the lawyer trying to twist her professionalism into something ugly and manipulative. And then she saw James, sitting in the back of the room, his presence steady and reassuring even from across the space. Yes, I knew him, Elena said, turning back to face the board. I knew him well enough to know that he had spent years telling people I was too damaged and too focused on my career to ever find love or happiness. I knew him well enough to know that he considered me unmarriageable and unworthy of the same consideration he gave to other members of my family. The room was completely silent now, the tension thick enough to cut. Elena continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. And despite knowing all of that, despite years of dismissal and cruelty, I spent 3 hours in an operating room, reconstructing his hand with the same care and skill I would give to anyone. Because that's what doctors do. We treat patients based on their medical needs, not on our personal feelings about them. She paused, letting that sink in. If Mr. Holloway is unhappy with his outcome, I suggest he consider whether his complaints are based on medical evidence or on disappointment that his gratitude didn't purchase him the personal relationship he expected. Marcus's face flushed red, his composure finally cracking. That's not what this is about, he said, his voice louder than was appropriate for the formal setting. This is about surgical incompetence, about corners cut and procedures rushed. Mr. Holloway, the board chair said firmly, please allow your attorney to speak for you. But Marcus was beyond listening to legal advice, beyond the careful strategy his lawyer had constructed. She's lying about the personal relationship, he said, pointing his perfectly functional left hand at Elena. She's trying to make it sound like I was vindictive, but the truth is she was jealous. Jealous that I chose her sister, jealous that she was alone while we were building a life together. James stood up from his seat in the back of the room, his movement fluid and purposeful. He walked down the aisle with the same calm confidence Elena had seen him display in emergency situations, when quick thinking and steady hands meant the difference between life and death. Excuse me, he said, addressing the board chair directly. Dr. James Chen, cardiac surgery. I was present for Mr. Holloway's initial surgery, and I'd like to address some factual inaccuracies in his testimony. The board chair looked surprised but nodded. Dr. Chen, you're welcome to provide relevant medical information. James moved to stand beside Elena, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, the quiet strength that had become so familiar to her over the past months. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, setting it deliberately on the table in front of the board. Mr. Holloway has suggested that Dr. Marchetti was motivated by jealousy over his relationship with her sister, James said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. I can speak to that assumption directly. He turned to Elena, his eyes warm with love and certainty. Elena, I had planned to do this somewhere more romantic, but I think this moment requires absolute clarity about where your heart belongs. Elena felt her breath catch as James opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in brilliant sparks. The room seemed to fade around the edges, leaving just the two of them in a bubble of perfect understanding. "Will you marry me?" James asked, his voice soft but audible to everyone in the room. "Will you build a life with someone who has known from the first day he met you that you are extraordinary, worthy of love, and completely capable of giving and receiving the kind of partnership that makes both people better?" Elena looked at the ring, at James's face, at the man who had seen her at her most professional and most vulnerable, who had never asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. The answer rose in her throat without hesitation, clear and certain, and absolutely true. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears she could feel gathering in her eyes. "Yes, of course, yes." As James slipped the ring onto her finger, Elena heard a small sound from across the table. She looked up to see Marcus staring at their joined hands, his face pale with the realization that his entire narrative had just collapsed. The woman he had dismissed as unmarriageable was being proposed to by one of the most respected surgeons in the hospital. The woman he had accused of jealousy was clearly, obviously, completely in love with someone who loved her back. The board chair cleared his throat, bringing the room back to official business. But there was something different in the atmosphere now, a shift in how Elena was being perceived. She was no longer the defendant in a professional misconduct case. She was a skilled surgeon who had performed exceptional work and was now publicly valued by a colleague whose opinion carried significant weight. "Dr. Chen," the board chair said, "can you speak to Dr. Marchetti's surgical competence based on your direct observation?" James looked down at Elena, then back at the board, his expression professional but his hand still holding hers. "Dr. Marchetti performed one of the most technically challenging hand reconstructions I have ever witnessed. Her surgical precision, her decision-making under pressure, and her patient care were all exemplary. Any complications Mr. Holloway has experienced are consistent with normal healing processes for severe crush injuries." The hearing concluded 30 minutes later with a formal dismissal of all charges against Elena. The board found no evidence of surgical misconduct, no support for claims of personal bias affecting medical care, and significant evidence of excellent surgical technique resulting in optimal patient outcomes. As they walked out of the building together, Elena felt lighter than she had in months, as if some weight she hadn't fully realized she was carrying had finally been lifted from her shoulders. James was quiet beside her, still processing what had just happened, the dramatic intersection of their personal and professional lives. "That wasn't exactly how I planned to propose," he said finally, stopping beside his car in the parking garage. Elena turned to face him, taking in the slight uncertainty in his expression, the way he was second-guessing his impulse to protect her so publicly. She reached up, cupping his face in her hands, and kissed him with all the gratitude and love and relief she had been holding back for weeks. "It was perfect," she said against his lips. "It was absolutely perfect." Because sometimes the most romantic gesture isn't flowers or candlelit dinners or carefully planned moments of intimacy. Sometimes it's someone stepping forward when you're under attack, someone saying with their actions that your worth is so obvious, so undeniable, that they're willing to stake their own reputation on defending it. Elena looked down at the ring on her finger, at the symbol of a love that had seen her at her most professional and most vulnerable and had chosen her anyway. She thought of Marcus, driving home with his perfectly reconstructed hand and his shattered assumptions about her life. She thought of Sarah, who would have to reckon with her own choices and her own complicity in trying to diminish Elena to make others feel bigger. But mostly she thought about the future she was building with James, the life they would create together based on mutual respect and shared values, and the quiet certainty that they had each found their person. The man who had once told her she would never find love had been wrong about everything that mattered. And the man who loved her had just proven it in front of a room full of witnesses, holding her hand while she stood her ground and speaking up for her when silence would have been safer. Elena Chen, she thought, trying out the sound of her future name. Dr. Elena Chen, married to a man who proposed to her during a medical board hearing and somehow made it the most romantic moment of her life. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well, loving deeply, and letting the truth speak for itself. The news of Elena's engagement spread through the hospital with the particular velocity that medical gossip always seemed to achieve. By the time she and James returned to Metropolitan General the next morning, every nurse, resident, and attending physician seemed to know not just about the proposal, but about the dramatic circumstances that had surrounded it. Elena found herself fielding congratulations and curious glances in equal measure as she made her rounds, each interaction a reminder of how public her personal life had suddenly become. Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of surgery, called Elena into her office that afternoon. Elena knocked on the door with some trepidation, uncertain whether she was about to receive congratulations or consequences for the spectacle at the medical board hearing. "Come in, Elena," Dr. Williams said, her voice giving away nothing. She was a woman in her early 60s who had built her career in an era when female surgeons were even rarer than they were now, and Elena had always found her both inspiring and slightly intimidating. "Dr. Williams, if this is about yesterday—" "Sit down," Dr. Williams interrupted gently, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "I wanted to talk to you about several things, actually." She pulled Elena's file from a stack on her desk, opening it to pages covered with evaluation scores and assessment notes. "Your residency performance has been exceptional from the beginning, but this past year has been particularly remarkable. Your hand reconstruction techniques are already beyond what we typically see from residents, and your patient outcomes are consistently excellent." Elena felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. "Thank you. I've been fortunate to work with excellent mentors." "Dr. Chen has been particularly complimentary about your work," Dr. Williams continued, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Though I suspect his assessment may not be entirely objective anymore." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but Dr. Williams waved away her embarrassment with a gesture. "Elena, what happened yesterday at the medical board hearing was unprecedented in my experience. Not the complaint itself, unfortunately those happen more often than we'd like, especially to female physicians. But the way it resolved, the public nature of Dr. Chen's support, and frankly, the obvious frivolousness of the accusations once all the facts were presented." Dr. Williams closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "I want you to know that this hospital stands firmly behind the quality of your work and your professional integrity." "I appreciate that more than I can express," Elena said quietly. "I also want you to know that we've received inquiries from 3 major medical centers about your availability for fellowships next year. Word travels fast in our community, and what happened yesterday has actually enhanced your reputation rather than damaging it. The surgical community doesn't like to see good doctors attacked for personal reasons." Elena blinked, surprised by this unexpected turn. She had been so focused on defending herself that she hadn't considered how the situation might affect her future opportunities. "There's something else," Dr. Williams continued. "We've also received a request from Mr. Holloway's insurance company for an independent review of his medical records. Apparently, his complaints to the medical board triggered an automatic review of the billing and treatment protocols." Her expression grew more serious. "Elena, I want you to prepare yourself for the possibility that this situation may not be over." That evening, Elena sat in James's apartment, surrounded by wedding planning magazines that seemed absurdly frivolous given the uncertainty that still clouded her professional future. James was cooking dinner, moving around his kitchen with the same precise efficiency he brought to surgery, and Elena found herself watching him with a mixture of love and amazement that this was now her life. "You're thinking too loudly," James said without turning around from the stove. "I can practically hear the gears turning from here." Elena smiled despite her anxiety. "Dr. Williams thinks Marcus's insurance company might cause more trouble." Apparently filing a medical board complaint triggered some kind of automatic review. James set down his spatula and turned to face her fully. "Elena, look at me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We have documentation of everything. We have expert opinions confirming the quality of your work. We have objective evidence that Marcus's outcomes were excellent." He moved to sit beside her on the couch, taking her hands in his. "Whatever happens next, we face it together. You're not fighting this alone anymore." The call came 2 weeks later, just as Elena was finishing a particularly complex reconstructive surgery on a pianist who had suffered nerve damage in a car accident. Her hands were still steady from the microsurgery when her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Williams asking her to come to her office immediately. Elena found Dr. Williams waiting with a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as David Chen, no relation to James, from the law firm that represented the hospital's insurance company. Elena's stomach dropped, assuming this meant the legal complications were escalating. "Elena, please sit down," Dr. Williams said. "Mr. Chen has some information about Mr. Holloway's case that I think you need to hear." David Chen opened a thick folder, pulling out several documents that looked like financial records and insurance forms. "Dr. Marchetti, as part of the routine review triggered by Mr. Holloway's complaint, we conducted a comprehensive examination of his medical history and insurance claims. What we found was quite interesting." He spread several papers across Dr. Williams's desk, pointing to highlighted sections. "Mr. Holloway has filed workers' compensation claims for 3 separate hand injuries over the past 5 years, all with different employers, all claiming permanent disability that prevented him from returning to work." Elena leaned forward, studying the documents with growing confusion. "But he told me he needed his hands for his contracting work. He said losing function would destroy his career." According to these records, Mr. Holloway has been claiming total disability from hand injuries since 2019, David Chen continued. He's been receiving monthly disability payments while apparently working under the table as a contractor. The injury that brought him to your emergency room was actually his 4th workers' compensation claim. Dr. Williams shook her head in disgust. "Insurance fraud." "Extensive insurance fraud," David Chen confirmed. "And when your surgery successfully restored function to his hand, it threatened his disability claims. If he admitted that his hand was working normally, he would lose his disability payments and potentially face criminal charges for the fraud he'd already committed." Elena felt pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "So the medical board complaint wasn't about the quality of my surgery. It was about creating documentation that his hand wasn't properly repaired, that he was still disabled." "Exactly," David Chen said. "By claiming that your surgery was inadequate, he could maintain his disability status while also working. The personal relationship between you was just convenient cover for what was essentially an attempt to defraud the insurance system." Elena sat back in her chair, feeling a mixture of relief and nausea. Relief that her surgical competence had never actually been in question, that Marcus's complaints had been motivated by financial fraud rather than legitimate medical concerns. But also nausea at the realization of how completely she had been manipulated, how her professional reputation had been weaponized in service of a criminal scheme. "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Now we turn this information over to the appropriate authorities," David Chen replied. "Mr. Holloway will likely face criminal charges for insurance fraud, and his complaint against you will be formally withdrawn with prejudice. Your medical record will be completely cleared." That evening, Elena called Sarah for the first time since the disastrous dinner weeks earlier. Her sister answered on the first ring, her voice tentative and uncertain. "Elena, I've been hoping you'd call. I need to apologize." "Sarah, I need to tell you something about Marcus," Elena interrupted gently. "Something you need to know before you make any more decisions about your relationship with him." Elena explained what the insurance investigation had revealed, watching through her apartment window as the city lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Sarah was quiet for long stretches, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her voice growing smaller and more strained as the full scope of Marcus's deception became clear. "He's been lying to me about everything," Sarah said finally, her voice thick with tears. "His work, his finances, his injury, even his feelings about you weren't real. They were just part of this scheme to protect his fraud." "Sarah, I'm so sorry," Elena said, meaning it completely. Whatever anger she had felt toward her sister had been burned away by the revelation of how thoroughly Marcus had manipulated all of them. "I feel so stupid," Sarah whispered. "I actually thought he had changed, that saving his hand had made him a better person. I thought he genuinely cared about you, that maybe we could all be a real family again." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the familiar ache of old family wounds that might finally have a chance to heal. "You're not stupid, Sarah. He was very convincing. He had years of practice lying to insurance companies and employers. Lying to us was probably the easiest part." They talked for another hour, carefully navigating around years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. Sarah apologized for asking Elena to consider Marcus's romantic overtures, for believing his claims about personal transformation, for prioritizing keeping the peace over protecting her sister's dignity. Elena apologized for her own part in the distance that had grown between them, for choosing career over family connection, for building walls that had made it easier for people like Marcus to drive wedges between them. "Elena," Sarah said near the end of their conversation, "I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you, even when I didn't know how to say it. What you've accomplished, the way you stood up for yourself, the way you found someone who loves you exactly as you are. I was wrong to ever let anyone make you feel like you were too much or not enough." Elena felt tears slide down her cheeks, the release of tension she had been carrying for years. "I love you too, Sarah. And I want you to know that you're going to be okay. You're going to find someone who doesn't lie to you, who doesn't try to manipulate you, who sees your kindness as a strength rather than a weakness to exploit." The criminal charges against Marcus were filed the following month. Elena never had to testify, as the documentary evidence of his insurance fraud was comprehensive enough to secure a conviction without her involvement. She learned from Dr. Williams that he had pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, and that part of his plea agreement included formal acknowledgement that his medical malpractice complaint had been filed in bad faith. Elena's name was formally cleared in all professional databases, and the hospital issued a statement praising her surgical excellence and professional integrity. The story made local medical journals as an example of how personal vendettas could be used to mask insurance fraud, and Elena found herself reluctantly famous in surgical circles as the resident who had been vindicated in spectacular fashion. But the professional vindication, satisfying as it was, mattered less to Elena than the personal healing that had begun with Sarah, the wedding planning that filled her evenings with joy instead of anxiety, and the quiet certainty that she had found her place in the world. James proposed to her again on a Saturday morning in bed, with no audience and no drama, just the two of them, and the early sunlight streaming through the windows of what was about to become their shared apartment. This proposal was different from the one at the medical board hearing, quieter but no less meaningful, a private affirmation of the love that had grown between them away from the chaos of external judgment. "I want to marry you when everything is calm," he said, slipping a second ring onto her finger, a wedding band to accompany the engagement ring that had been born in conflict. "I want to marry you when there's no one to prove wrong, no point to make, nothing to defend against. Just us, choosing each other because we want to build a life together." Elena looked down at her hands, at the rings that symbolized both the dramatic moment when James had stood up for her and this quieter moment when they were simply choosing love for its own sake. She thought about the long journey that had brought her here, from the emergency room where she had first saved Marcus's hand, to this bedroom where she was planning a future with a man who had never doubted her worth. "Yes," she said, kissing him softly, "yes to all of it, yes to the quiet moments and the dramatic ones. Yes to building something together that no one can take away from us." Outside their window, the city was waking up to another ordinary Saturday. Somewhere across town, Marcus was probably beginning another day of consequences for his choices. Somewhere else, Sarah was probably having her first cup of coffee as a single woman, learning how to trust her own judgment again. But here, in this bed, in this moment, Elena was exactly where she belonged. With someone who had seen her strength and her vulnerability, her professional competence and her personal fears, and had chosen all of it. Someone who had proposed to her in front of a room full of strangers to prove a point, and then proposed again in private simply because he loved her. The woman who had once been told she was too damaged for love was about to marry the man who had taken her hand in his and proven that some stories can be rewritten, that some wounds can heal completely, and that sometimes the best victory is simply being deeply, completely, unquestionably loved. 2 years later, Elena stood in the observation deck of the new reconstructive surgery wing at Metropolitan General, watching first-year residents practice microsurgery techniques on cadaveric specimens. The wing bore a small plaque near the entrance. The Marchetti Chen Center for Hand Reconstruction, funded by a research grant she and James had secured together. Sarah knocked softly on the door, entering with 2 cups of tea and a nervous smile. Their relationship had rebuilt slowly, carefully, like the delicate surgical reconstructions Elena performed daily. Sarah had moved to the city 6 months ago, starting fresh after ending things with Marcus permanently. The residents looked terrified, Sarah observed, watching the young doctors fumble with surgical instruments. Elena laughed. I was just as scared when I started. The difference is, now they have better supervision and more realistic expectations about healing timelines. Through the window, she could see James in the cardiac unit across the courtyard, his confident movements visible even from this distance. They had married in a small ceremony the previous spring, surrounded by colleagues who had become family and family who had learned to appreciate the choices Elena had made. "Any word from Marcus lately?" Sarah asked quietly. Elena shook her head. "His parole officer sends updates occasionally. He's working construction again, legitimately this time. Apparently he's required to report any injuries immediately as part of his fraud monitoring." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the strange justice in that arrangement. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't saved his hand that night?" Elena considered the question seriously. "I think everything would have unfolded exactly as it did. The insurance fraud would have been discovered eventually, and I still would have met James, still would have found my way to this life." She turned to face her sister. "The only difference is that Marcus would have lost his hand, and I would have had to live with knowing I could have prevented that." "Even after everything he put you through?" "Especially after everything he put you through," Elena said firmly. "Sarah, the moment I chose to save his hand instead of walking away, I chose to be the person I wanted to be regardless of how he treated me. That choice protected me more than any revenge could have." Sarah nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. "You chose to be better than the situation." "I chose to be myself," Elena corrected gently. "And it turned out that was enough." Elena's phone buzzed with a text from James. "Surgery finished early. Want to grab dinner and plan our weekend getaway?" She smiled, typing back a quick yes before turning to Sarah. "You know what Marcus was right about?" Elena said, surprising her sister. "I am too intense for some people. I do prioritize my work. I am demanding and focused and unwilling to settle for less than I deserve." She gestured toward the surgical wing, toward the life she had built. "But those aren't flaws to be fixed. They're strengths that led me exactly where I was meant to be." Sarah hugged her sister tightly. "I'm glad you never listened to him. I'm glad you became exactly who you are." As they walked through the hospital corridors together, Elena reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. Marcus had been wrong about her capacity for love, but he had been accidentally right about one thing. She was unmarriageable to someone who needed her to be smaller, quieter, less ambitious. She was perfectly marriageable to someone who celebrated her exactly as she was. The woman who had once been told she would never find love had found something better than love. She had found partnership, respect, and the deep satisfaction of a life lived on her own terms. And sometimes, that was the greatest victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.